So if you're trying to make the jump from having an amateur volunteer sound team to one that acts more professionally, these are 3 things that you need for your sound system. And no, they're not gear, so you don't have to spend any money on them. It just takes your time and effort, and it kind of feels like eating your spinach. It's not all that fun, but it's really good for you. Hey, if you're new here, my name is James and I help worship leaders and sound techs and tech directors eliminate the mystery and frustration around sound at church. So if that's you, you found the right place, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and welcome to the club of sound ninjas. The first document that you really need to have handy at front of house is the input list. The input list is your roadmap for how everything should be plugged in and all the different steps along the way, how it gets there, and then where stuff should go out from the console as well. Most of the time I make these in a spreadsheet, so Excel, Google Sheets, or Numbers on Mac. You can make this very easily and it doesn't require calculations as much as it does a table so that you can put stuff in the right place and keep it organized. The first column is the channel number followed by what input or instrument is going to go into that channel. From there, we list what type of microphone or DI is being used and whether or not that input requires phantom power. This can be really helpful when you get in a pinch and something's not working. You can just ask the sheet, does this need phantom power? And if it has a little checkbox, yes, turn on the phantom power and that should work if everything else is plugged in correctly. Speaking of where it's plugged in, sometimes our inputs get plugged in straight into the board. And so channel 1 equals channel 1, and it's very simple. That's not always the case though, because sometimes we have sub-snakes. So if there's a group of channels on the drums and we have one big snake that goes from there all the way to our inputs, that's a lot simpler to use and to set up, but it adds another layer of complexity in where should this be plugged in. Other times you have floor pockets built in and you have to have those labeled with either a letter or a color so that those are easy to understand what came from where, and so we're not hunting around with 17,000 different numbers. If you have a digital console, that makes it a lot more flexible for where things can be plugged in, either with a remote stage box or several stage boxes that accept your analog input and turn it into a digital signal that then shows up at your board. The problem with that is a thing called digital patching, where mic input number 1 could show up on channel 23 on the board, and that can get really confusing, especially for a volunteer. If you have all of it mapped out and laid out on a piece of paper, it gets a lot easier to understand, especially if something starts not working or you had to unplug a bunch of stuff to get it working again. This is especially helpful if something suddenly stops working and you're trying to troubleshoot, or if you had something like a wedding where you had to tear down the stage, unplug a bunch of stuff, and now you're trying to plug it in again to get ready for Sunday morning. So digital patching can help us lay out our console better, even if inputs aren't plugged in the right spot on stage. We can get everything aligned on the board so that it makes sense for a user to walk up to and they're like, okay, this is laid out pretty logically. I can learn and understand this quite easily. However, if you have to redo digital patching, it can become a nightmare in a hurry. And there's a reason why it looks like the game Minesweeper is because when you get it wrong, you can end somebody's not really life, but it makes your morning a lot harder. We'll say it that way. So just for the record, so everybody's got it straight. Just because it's plugged in to preamp number 1 on your digital console doesn't mean that it's showing up on channel number 1 on your digital console. If that's going to help you take less ibuprofen, go ahead and mash that like button. Other inputs that you might need to document on your console that might not be coming from the stage could be things like playback inputs, either from video or an 1/8" input for your iPad or Spotify playback. Something of that nature needs to be written down on where it is and then where it gets plugged in. Because heaven forbid somebody borrows your 1/8" input cable and then puts it back in the wrong spot and you don't know where it should be plugged in. These are pretty important things that you don't want to have to track down right before service. Now that we've got everything arranged on our console as far as the inputs go, we can move on to thinking about our outputs. I also like to make a list of all of my buses that I have available on the console and the matrices or matrix sends that are groups of groups. This is where I'll label what output it is, where it's going, either on an output on the back of the board, or your remote stage box might have some outputs built into it, or if it's going digitally into another unit like a personal monitor mixer. I'll label all of that and then also include whether that should be a pre or post fader aux send. In general, we use post fader aux sends for things like effects, reverb and delay, chorus even if you will, or pre fader aux sends are usually used for monitor mixes. Monitor mixes don't want to be affected by the front of house sends. So if you're turning something down in the house for safety first, you don't necessarily want that to get quieter in everybody's monitor mixes as well. Even if they don't sound great, they still need to be able to hear themselves. So for that reason, I typically do post fader for effects and pre-fader for monitor sends. Your setup might include two different consoles, and sometimes we need inputs that show up at the front of house console to go to the monitor or to the broadcast console. So you need to be able to document how those channels are getting there and document what tie lines are getting where. Because when it doesn't work or something gets reset, you really don't want to have to re-engineer that in a pinch.
I'm in Google Docs, and I call this input list template. I have my channels, my inputs, which mic it's going to be, and then whether or not it needs phantom power. We've got what subsnake it's plugged into so that we know where it's going from the microphone input all the way to the soundboard. Any notes on that input. And then I also want to list out what my aux sends are doing on my board if it's not already set up, or if it is set up, we want to know what those are and have those labeled. And we want to talk about our monitor mixer inputs. I'm imagining that we're using, a Midas or Behringer X32 for this instance, just because I know how many buses it has. Your console might vary, and so you'll have to tailor this to work for you. I'm also going to show you a couple little fun shortcuts to use along the way in a program like Excel or Google Sheets. So for the channel numbers, you might be tempted to just type in 1, 2, 3 and keep going all the way down to 32. But if you highlight all of these and then click on this dot down to the bottom and then drag down, it will autofill that sequence all the way down to the bottom. So that should save you some time. I also know that I have aux inputs. So these aux inputs are handy for something like your playback system or an iPad, whatever you're using for something extra that doesn't necessarily need a mic preamp. It can come in line level. So we're gonna call these A1 and A2, and it goes to 6. So I'm gonna just, oops, did too many, delete on that. So we've got our aux inputs, and maybe we'll label our effects returns as well. So we've got 4 effects units, so we know what's going on there. We've also got our aux sends. We've got 16 buses or aux sends. Maybe you call these buses. And then we can just take all these 1 through 16, hit Command C or Control C on a PC, and then Command or Control V over here so that we can get our buses and our P16 inputs. And they're labeled and ready to go. Over here, one kind of fun pro tip on Google Sheets is on the 48 volts section. I'm actually going to insert a checkbox. That just makes it a lot easier, to denote whether or not you need that. And maybe you go through and on these, you want things centered or to the left. You can do all that formatting stuff if you'd like. It's not as important to me.
So that's the input list. You should probably print it out and make it laminated. Maybe just slide it under the soundboard, but teach your sound techs how to actually use it so when they get in a pinch, they're not overwhelmed. They know where to go to find it so that they can have that plan and start working through steps to figure out what's not working and how to get it working again. Another option is to put it in the cloud and print out a QR code that somebody can scan with their phone and pull it up digitally. This makes it a lot easier to walk around with, and any changes don't have to be reprinted and laminated. So that makes it a little bit more flexible and easier for people to find. You just have to teach them how to use that. The next thing that you need to set up your sound team for success are standard operating procedures. This is the checklist that has to happen every single week for every single service so that things don't get forgotten. Everything from startup procedures to running through the service, making sure that you're checking the broadcast output, and all the different little things just need to be put on this checklist because the shortest pencil is better than the longest memory. This is also really useful for bringing on new volunteers because one of the things that keeps people from actually staying on the sound team, or any tech team for that matter, is feeling overwhelmed or like they're not able to learn it. But if you take the memorization of all the processes and you distill that down to a checklist that they just need to know, oh, I need to follow the checklist makes it a lot less intimidating. They're going to have an easier time joining and staying on the sound team. And if I know anything about church sound teams, you always are having to recruit and develop new sound techs. You don't want to make that worse by having the processes more complicated. Then when they forget something, they feel terrible and then they don't want to do it again. We want to avoid all of that and give them a great system with our standard operating procedures. You could do this with a laminated sheet and a dry erase marker, but what I think is probably easier is to use Notion with a checklist and a QR code. That way they can even bring it up on one of the computers that are right beside the sound booth. Just make sure that they're going through that checklist and nothing gets forgotten. There are only a few feelings worse than making a mistake in the middle of church and really regretting it, because you're creating a distraction in a moment that's supposed to be holy. But when you really crush it and you do a great job, that feeling is amazing. You know you're serving well. You know that you're contributing to the spiritual life and formation of your congregation. It's really awesome when you get it right. So let's make sure that our teams are able to get it right more than they're getting it wrong by giving them a checklist to follow. Again, this doesn't cost you any money, just some time and effort. Oh, and if you're a worship leader or a tech director that's in charge of areas more than just sound, this does work for your lighting and screens and video people too. Yeah, it takes a lot of work on the front end, but it's totally worth it. I can't recommend it enough. The final document that you need to have in your sound booth is a style guide. A style guide basically just tells people what your expectations are for how it should sound. Musical styles and genres and even mixing styles are very subjective. What's appealing to one person might not be appealing to another person. And so how do we define what's kind of right and wrong for our congregation and for our crew? When you put clear language on it, you can have conversations about corrections when it's clearly wrong. Say, hey, I know you like it this way, but for our congregation, we like it this way. And it removes the personal attack or the creative differences from the equation. It just says, this is what the standard is for how we want it to sound for our congregation. Some congregations might want to have it loud and in your face so that people can feel like they can sing loud without other people hearing them. Other churches might want to have the music a little bit quieter so that when people sing, they hear the people around them singing and it feels like everybody together. Neither one of these is right or wrong, but you need to define what it should be for your congregation, and even define that there are moments where it goes more in one direction than another in your church, and that might be awesome too. Another thing you need to clarify is how loud the bass should be. Because for certain congregations and their demographics, they want a bass to feel like an upright bass that's far away and yes, producing those low frequencies, but not to the point where I can feel it in my chest. For other people, if it's not thumping your chest, they're disappointed and they think you should turn up the bass. To avoid mixing by democracy, having this style guide written out and clarified and developed as a team really helps go a long way to making sure that we're hitting the mark and we know when we need to correct our course a little bit in the way that the mix feels. If you're not sure where to start or what all the parameters are, I've got a free guide for you called How to Lead Your Church Sound Team. There's a section in there that helps you discuss what all the different parameters are so that you can put it on paper, put language to it, and have conversations with your team so it's not just this nebulous like, oh, this is good and this is not good. You actually put real language to it so that it becomes a clearer mark for them to aim at. Another thing to clarify with your team is understanding who gets to give input to the sound tech. Earlier, I mentioned mixing by democracy, and that never works. You can't take every individual person's input to create a mix. At some point, the leaders need to actually lead and say, this is what we expect. And if there's too much pushback, the leaders can deal with that. You just shouldn't have to deal with that as the sound tech. But as a worship leader and a tech director, you really need to be clear about what the objectives are so that you can course correct. And it's not just my preference versus your preference. Also, when you have those designated people who can kind of give feedback or are authorized to give feedback, it makes the lines of communication a lot clearer. And again, we're trying to make things easy for sound volunteers. So if they know who they answer to, if somebody comes up and complains, you can say, hey, I hear you. Can you go over and talk to so-and-so? I answer to them and they can help you a lot more than I can right now. By designating this person that can give feedback to the sound tech, you also get somebody that's looking out for your sound tech so that they can encourage them and maybe give them the help that they need when they're feeling a little bit down or discouraged about how well mixing is going. A little bit of encouragement can go a really long way. So don't underestimate designating somebody to do that for your techs. Now, as we wrap up this video, know that none of these things are really fun. They're not going to be enjoyable to do, but they get you a whole lot of benefit in the long run. Now, if you're ready to take your mixing to the next step, or to understand audio and all the different ins and outs, and even walking through how to make input lists and how to evaluate your team, I've got classes for you in my Attaway Audio Academy. It's got a new low price at just $19 a month, and in there we've got 5 different courses that are aimed at sound techs, tech directors, and worship leaders. In addition to all that, we've got weekly live Q&A where you can come and pick my brain on things that are bugging you, things that you need help with right in the moment that maybe you can't find right then in the courses. We have a lot of fun, and it's a great way to connect every week. You can find more information at attawayaudio.com/academy. If you liked this video and want to see more content helping church sound techs, worship leaders, and tech directors, go ahead and mash that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit like and leave a comment below and let me know what you're going to tackle first. As always, remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.